Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the Webex Chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you require technical assistance, please send the chat to the event producer. To submit a written question, please be sure to select all panelists from the drop-down menu in Webex Chat before you type in your question in the message box provided and then press Enter on your keyboard. All audio lines will remain muted for the duration of this webinar, and there will be no verbal Q&A today. With that, I'll turn the call over to Liz Fernandez. Liz, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone, and I'd also like to welcome you to today's webinar. I'm Liz Fernandez with the Professional Development Services Branch. We have two speakers for today's webinar. Dr. Julie Helm has been the poultry veterinarian for Clemson University Livestock Poultry Health for 23 years, serving as a South Carolina National Poultry Improvement Plan State Inspector, Poultry Diagnostician, and Small Flock Extension Veterinarian. She is the self-proclaimed Biosecurity Queen of South Carolina and was on the working groups for the Secure Poultry Supply Plans, currently now on the Upland Game Bird Working Group. She has held the Vice Chair and Chair for USDA-APHIS Committee on Poultry and Other Avian Species and several times as the South Atlantic Region member for the National Poultry Improvement Plan General Conference Committee. She received her BS in Poultry Science and DBM from Oregon State University, completed a poultry medicine internship at North Carolina State University, is board certified with the American College of Poultry Veterinarians, and is a foreign animal disease diagnostician. She is a proud mom of 2 Eagle Scouts and serves on 2 Scout troops. Our second speaker is Dr. Michael Martin. Dr. Martin is the Director of Poultry Programs at the North Carolina Department of Ag and Consumer Services and has been in that position for the past 3 years. Previously, Dr. Martin was the Associate Professor at the North Carolina State University College of Veterinary Medicine, where he was the Head of Poultry Clinical Activities and Residency Program. He obtained his veterinary degree, Master's of Preventative Medicine, and Poultry Medicine Residency training from the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of California, Davis, and is a board-certified diplomat by the American College of Poultry Veterinarians. And with that, I'm going to turn the webinar over to Dr. Helm and Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Liz, and to everyone who's joined the webinar. Dr. Martin and I have a lot to share with you, so we will get started. We will be presenting our North and South Carolina H7N3 Lowpass and Hpai event that occurred in March and April of this year and share with you the lessons we had learned. In total, there were 12 farms with Lowpass and 1 farm with Hpai, and all were commercial turkeys. The 12 Lowpass cases included 2 breeder farms and 10 meat farms consisting of over 304,000 birds. 11 of the 12 flocks were asymptomatic. The 1 Hpai case was a commercial meat turkey farm located in South Carolina with over 32,000 birds. The meat turkey ages ranged from 12 to 18 weeks. 1 breeder flock was located in the pre-laid darkout house, and the 2nd breeder flock was a young breeder flock, and this was the flock that did show some symptoms. This map is showing all of the 13 cases in both states. The red circles are the 3-kilometer zones, and the blue circles are the 10-kilometer zones that surrounded each of the infected premises. The 11 Lowpass North Carolina cases were located in 2 adjacent counties, which were densely populated with commercial broiler, broiler breeder, turkey breeder, and table egg farms. The 2 South Carolina cases were located in 1 county, which was fairly sparsely populated, mainly with turkey and broiler breeder farms, and 1 each of a broiler and table egg layer. The Hpai farm is the farm that you see in the southernmost edge of the map. The Lowpass H7N3 virus was from North American wild bird lineage. This virus was not associated with any previous U.S. poultry events. Initial sequencing did suggest that this virus was at risk of mutating from Lowpass to Hpai, and USDA rapidly approved both North and South Carolina to depopulate these flocks, which facilitated a rapid response from the beginning of the event, and we really believe helped stop this from exploding into a bigger situation.
Depopulation was primarily done by foam depopulation because of the equipment and people training of people in the Carolinas. It was performed by state personnel with the assistance of company integrator personnel. And all the depopulation on all the farms was done within 24 hours based upon the approval from USDA to move forward with indemnity and compensation, and also based upon water source availability, which was provided by the industry directly. For North Carolina, birds were disposed of by compost. We do have a very strict restriction on burial for dead animals for mass mortality in North Carolina. And so when we were looking at the disposal on all these farms, litter and feed included, composting was the primary method.
In South Carolina, we were able to bury the birds in approved sites on the farm. The manure, litter, and feed were composted in the barns initially, and after the first heat treatment cycle, the compost was moved and turned outside on the property to complete the second heat cycle. Allowing the compost to move out of the barns after the first heat cycle was reached helped to start the cleaning process earlier.
One of the interesting things that came of this was the first 3 farms that were identified with low-path avian influenza, all found in North Carolina. It was 2 meat turkey farms that were tested positive based upon routine NTIP pre-slaughter movement samples, and then the 1 clinical farm which only showed a slight drop in egg production in a turkey breeder farm in 2 of the 7 houses. Those 3 farms came from 3 completely different integrators, was sourced by 3 completely different feed mills and had completely different methods of disposal. These were also geographically distinct farms, as can be seen by the map here. So the 2 farms that were closest to each other were just over 8 kilometers apart, and then those 2 farms were approximately 30 kilometers from the 3rd positive farm. All the 2 southernmost farms were around 7 to 8 kilometers from the South Carolina border.
2 of the North Carolina low-path surveillance zones did drop down into South Carolina, and this is how we found our first low-path AI farm. More North Carolina low-path farms were found between March 13th and April 1st through zone testing and pre-movement testing. Most of these cases were from a single integrator because mainly the integrator had the heaviest density of farms in that region. The low-path zones were tested twice, initially when the zone was established and then again 14 to 21 days later. The South Carolina zone was released on April 2nd. Most of the North Carolina zones were released by April 5th, with the last one released on April 17th. And just when you think you are done and allowed to go home, you get a call Monday morning at 8 a.m. from a turkey supervisor notifying you that he had received a call from a grower about increased mortality and respiratory signs overnight, and he is on his way out to the farm to collect samples. This was a 12-week-old Tom turkey farm with only 1 out of the 5 houses showing signs. Mortality on Friday was normal for this age with 4 birds. Saturday it was 7 birds. Sunday it did double to 14, and the birds started showing respiratory signs. They started snicking. By Monday morning's call, the mortality was over 50 birds, and the total for the end of that day was close to 100. Once again, the other 4 houses had no increase in mortality or symptoms. This farm was actually the contact farm, the same grower from our first low-path farm. Once his farm was detected positive, the grower did not return to this current second farm, and he had always had separate personnel working the 2 farms. This farm had been tested 3 times prior to this. The March 15th and 31st dates were mimicking the low-path zone testing just north of this location, and the middle testing date was actually the company collecting additional samples on their own, as they were very concerned that this farm would also pop up positive for low-path. The image at the top is showing the layout of the farm with the 5th house closest to the public road. The middle number 3 house in red was the house that contained the mortality. There is a pond located on this property about 150 yards from the main driveway, and with a few wild waterfowl were seen and heard on the pond, but the grower reported that these birds were never near the vicinity of the houses. The next day, we had a presumptive positive AI matrix and H7 PCR results in our state Nolan laboratory from all 5 houses. 4 dead birds were also submitted for necropsy and also tested positive for H7 PCR. Depopulation was approved and was performed the next day, and now that it is 2 days later, we had about 2,500 birds that were either dead or too sick to move in that 1 house. NVSL worked very late into the night and reported to us that we had both low-path and high-path viruses H7N3 in that one house. There were Lowpass viruses isolated in the 3 other houses. The last house had no viruses isolated, but there was H7 PCR detection with a very high CT level. So now we transition from a low-path AI response to a high-path AI response. The established low-path zone became a control area with increased weekly testing. A minimum of 3 weeks of testing is required, but we decided to also do a 4th week of zone testing, and all testing was negative. Low-path AI movement documents, procedures, and testing transitioned into the EMERS permitting system. We established the gateway permitting with the industry and receiving states and used the secure poultry supply plans to move hatchery chicks and 1 flock of broilers. We also notified our public health veterinarian about the situation so she could start monitoring the people closely involved with this farm.
There was additional testing that was considered during the event when it moved from a low path to high path. But for a background first, just wanted to show you guys what North Carolina and South Carolina was doing for its baseline testing. Also, just keep in mind that it was based upon baseline testing that we identified those first 3 farms all in the same day. So we felt that the baseline testing was effective as far as being able to identify early cases. The additional testing, again, did come when we transitioned to high path. North and South Carolina, we continue to do surveillance for targeted marketing. In South Carolina, the surveillance zone area moved from a 10 kilometers to a 20 kilometers for a single time testing, just to cast a bigger net over the area. In North Carolina, we didn't do any additional testing when it changed to high path. And part of that was because we were already very aggressively testing throughout the low path event, specifically because the sequencing was showing it very close to mutation towards the high path isolate. The other thing just to kind of make note of was that we had a single integrator that did have the greatest number of farms and also had the greatest regional density in that area. And when you looked at all the integrators in that area that were turkey integrators, there was no one integrator that had a higher incidence than any other during that area. So the great number of positive cases associated with one integrator was solely based upon their density.
In both states with all farms, we used wet cleaning and wet disinfection of the houses and equipment with a cleaning inspection in between. Environmental swabs were collected. North Carolina used their state non-laboratory to perform the PCR testing, with any non-negative swabs sent to NVSL for virus isolation. In South Carolina, we decided to collect the swabs and send them directly to NVSL for the initial PCR testing. In the top picture, you'll see your classic Carolina 30 to 40-year-old turkey barn during the cleaning inspection. Using technology where you can, the top right picture is showing me FaceTiming with the inspector as he inspects the cleaning job, and I get a walk around the farm with him during the inspection from my office. We collected swabs from feeders, waterers, corners of the barn where sick birds may have been huddling, curtains, windowsills, frames, fans, and any place where a human hand may have touched, such as handles, doorknobs, and switches.
There was an epidemiological survey that was done during the end of the event, and at that time, North Carolina and South Carolina had called upon USDA resources to facilitate the epidemiological survey. So there were a lot of agencies from USDA, including SIA, that were involved and were directly responsible for creating a questionnaire for the event. That questionnaire was evaluated and reviewed by both Dr. Helm in South Carolina and myself in North Carolina, as well as other individuals of the state, and we provided our feedback, as well as the industry provided some feedback before it was rolled out. The data is still under analysis by USDA. There's a lot of lessons that are learned that we're going to go over here in the back half of this presentation. And some are specific to North Carolina, some are specific to South Carolina, and then some are more global between both North and South Carolina. As you can imagine, communication was definitely something that we learned not only in this event, but in all these events, just learning a little bit more from every time we have to go through something similar like this. In general, there was pretty good communication between the various agencies in the industry, and that was definitely very helpful as far as facilitating a response. And I will say that between North Carolina, South Carolina specifically, we had a lot of close interaction, a lot of time that Dr. Helm and I spent together on the phone, sharing data, sharing forms. That was immensely helpful for us to kind of come together and help kind of squash this bug in its tracks. One of the things that we noticed is that if you look at all the events for avian influenza going back to 2014, 2015 Hpai in the Midwest, and then Indiana's situation that they had with some avian influenza outbreaks, the Lowpass Hpai outbreak that occurred in Kentucky, Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama, that throughout those events, we end up learning more and more, even if you're not a state that's affected by that. And so regional animal health associations, in our case, SAHA, Southern Animal Health Association, learned a lot, had big discussions, group meetings, and worked engaged with industry, so we were all improving. And this was a really good step for us in preparation to this event. One of the things we noticed, though, is that when it got to then communications on the federal versus the state level, that a lot of those communications seemed to be more like we were back at 2014, 2015 in those early stages of responding to these types of events. So one of the things that we would like to see as far as a lesson learned is trying to grow that communication as best as we can to have this communication improve and mirror what has been done on the state level and the industry level as far as preparedness for these events. Some of the field communications, and this is just one example that were going on, there were individuals from lots of different agencies that were on the ground responding as best they could. And oftentimes we would get some communications that would go directly to USDA instead of going through our incident command structure. That eventually did get cycled in, and we were eventually all able to communicate with this. But this is something that we felt that was a good lesson learned to try to improve on for future events, so that way we can have this communication happening through the chain of command as it normally would. For North Carolina, I'll say that one of the biggest lessons learned was just that our avian influenza plan needed updating. It was in the process of being updated for readability, but not necessarily content during the event when it hit. And so as such, what we did in North Carolina side is we really tried to be flexible and do things that seemed pragmatic as we went, following the Southern Animal Health Association Working Group Lowpass plan, which South Carolina had already adopted. For various reasons, North Carolina hadn't been able to partake in some of those plannings for SAHA due to illness and other types of logistic issues. And so we were kind of behind the ball for that compared to South Carolina cohort. So we used the South Carolina plan, communicated with Dr. Helm extensively. We used the USDA guidance documentation, which was also an excellent reference and resource as well, to try to come together on that. And these interactions did help facilitate our state and federal communications, and it was good from the standpoint of communication in general. There's still some things that could have been worked out, cleaned up, like before there's public announcements, seeing what those proofs might be ahead of time would have been helpful on the state level. We did have some minor glitches that were rectified before they became problems, but that's always an area for improvement for our communication. We did not have anybody in the North Carolina side that was effectively trained in positions like case managers and site managers, which are critical from the USDA standpoint as far as response and all the proper paperwork that needs to be in play and assessments that need to be in play for indemnity and compensation. So as such, we did rely heavily on USDA personnel, and we did have some of our staff inserted that did not have proper training. I think that if our staff had been better trained, there might have been a clear delineation of responsibilities and our ability to be able to step in as site managers a little bit more effectively. And so this is something that, I feel like if we can get more of our state personnel trained in these positions, this would be a very effective thing. And although we did have state personnel that were trained in EMERS and helped us out significantly, there's always a need for more EMERS training, and that's just something that I think is just going to have to be an ongoing process just to keep our state personnel up to speed and ready for an event. Litter spreading came as a big concern during this event in that there were certain companies that saw litter being spread in our surveillance areas and were worried that it was coming from infected premises. So there was a lot of communication back and forth with the industry and trying to make sure everybody was satisfied with what was actually being spread. And there was some talk about just holding all litter spreading in a surveillance area, period, during a low-path event. And there was some citation of other states that supposedly had done this. When we tried to contact states that supposedly had litter restrictions for surveillance areas, none of these states actually said that they did. And really what became the complicating factor is that you had so many different integrators or agencies that were involved. You had crop needs, there was litter that were stored from ages ago, there was non-poultry litter sources. So this is something, although it was raised as a concern, what we learned is that there probably is no real effective way to stop all spreading of litter. You really just have to stick with infected farms and poultry prems in the surveillance area. We did have a lot of challenges, and this will get revisited in our COVID comment slides, between the centralization and regionalization of incident command structures. This is always an ongoing issue, and we learn a little bit more every time we go through this. The other lesson learned that we had was that for USDA resources, when we're requiring a team or equipment, we really felt like we need to better clarify ahead of time what needs there are for those teams on site, like porta potties, et cetera, just so that that way when that team falls on site, that they have everything they need to get started immediately and they're not waiting on any additional equipment or supplies, and that hopefully all that equipment that comes with them is well maintained and ready to function as well. One of the last things on the North Carolina side specifically is that we did feel that there needed to be a clear delineation between state and federal field responses in regards to issues like biosecurity, inspections, environmental sampling, and financial oversight. Because there were some inconsistencies on who was actually in charge of certain situations, it did lead to some inconsistent messaging that we found was probably confusing to industry and contractors. South Carolina was in a position where they had more autonomy with their field operations, and they really had a clear delineation that if something was associated with quarantines, disease control, that was a state-led operation, whereas something was more driven towards financials, either assessment of how things were financially being used on the farms, that type of thing, should definitely fall under USDA. And we feel that maybe a similar delineation on the North Carolina side would have probably alleviated some of the confusion that did occur on the ground.
For South Carolina, we had many lessons to learn as we had many first times for us. This is the first time we used our Lowpass AI plan, and it was the first time we really worked in an ICS structure for a large disease event. The good news is that our recently updated Lowpass plan worked very, very well, with only a few red pen updates I did during the event. It did help us transition into Hpai AI, and 2 of my homework assignments are to create a Hpai AI attachment to our Lowpass plan to include all the procedures that change as we transition into Hpai response. I will also want to create work instructions or cliff notes for each of the ICS sections to help organize all the detailed response actions that need to occur so they will know what to expect. The SAHA planning and collaboration was invaluable for this event. After the 2017 Lowpass AI event, Dr. Fraser in Alabama had the foresight to call in all his neighbors and then all their neighbors and then eventually all the SAHA states to come together as a region to try to get our Lowpass plans as similar as possible, specifically with testing. What came out of these meetings was a Lowpass AI testing matrix for zones and movement, which allowed easier movements of birds and eggs out of the zone and interstate to these same states. We had an initial call from Dr. Parr to the other state veterinarians stating, we are initiating our plan and the SAHA testing matrix. Will you accept our product? And they did. The lesson is so valuable that we need to continue to review plans as a region, especially after events occurred such as ours. And this is a big one, the commercial farm data. Updating the farm data, whether it's retired farms, active farms, new farms, is really not an activity you want to do at the beginning of an incident. Unfortunately, it's expected and will always continue to occur. We needed to update some of our farm data at the state level, and the companies were very responsive in cleaning up their farm lists. It did seem USDA was using older data in their EMERs, and what they saw as populations of farms and AI surveillance testing in South Carolina was not the same as we knew what was occurring in the state level. They were recommending more testing than we felt was necessary, as we were still concerned about additional testing would present a biosecurity risk and spread more virus out to the farms. We had to send both updated farm data and routine AI testing data to USDA to show what our active farm population looked like and the current surveillance that was occurring above and beyond the response testing. At the state level, our biggest problem is retrieving all of the AI testing data that is occurring in South Carolina in out-of-state labs. We had to contact the other labs and companies. They sent us Excel sheets of test data. We then had to create maps for USDA to show that all the surveillance that was actually occurring throughout the state. This really needs to change. Out-of-state MPIP labs who are testing South Carolina flocks need to directly message testing data into our database electronically so we can be readily accessible in situations such as this, and to reduce days of gathering information when you're busy doing other activities. What did work very well was using the federal PIN numbers as unique identifiers for each farm. It provides better communication between the state and industry and the state and USDA. Nearly all our commercial farms have a federal PIN number. We did have to do some teaching to remind some companies to use their PIN numbers for both the testing and the movement that normally do not use our lab for their submissions. My game plan is to, in order to help maintain current farm data, is to update the company's farm list as we do our annual NPIP inspections and audits for that company. For the commercial farm sampling collection, we use our industry employees as part of our response team, and they collect their own samples. And I do have an annual training for new hires on routine NPIP and AI event sampling. My sampling instructions to the companies went through many revisions for Lowpass and Hpai. And working with the companies, in the end, I had to remember to keep it as simple as possible. There were also concerns that the company responders were not sampling properly. They were not targeting dead and sick birds. They were not collecting throughout the whole house. So I see that I need to change to do continuous training with all the company responders on a routine schedule rather than just capturing the new hires every year. In South Carolina, we did use a hybrid ICS structure since we are small staff and we wear multiple hats in peacetime and in events. And this system worked well for us for this event. We did have people placed into positions they were not trained for, and you had to learn as you go. It would have been beneficial to have some time, position, templates, and checklists to use in these situations. And we did get some of these packages from Minnesota that were very helpful. We need to have continuous training for incident management team positions with our staff, alternating between different positions depending on the type of event. We did use a pre-made dark-out Hpai AI website that we quickly activated. I do thank Minnesota again for letting me use their template that they had used in 2015. In our laboratory, we suddenly had to find a new place away from receiving to decontaminate the event samples. So on the spot, we found a biosafety cabinet in the necropsy room for this process and created workflow protocols to manage the identification of individual samples. We are now requesting funding to get the receiving area their very own biosafety cabinet to use on any samples, and we are also asking for funding for another PCR system to increase our surge capacity and one that can actually run different disease-type PCRs at the same time. For depopulation, we need to maintain the foaming equipment and supplies, and we need to continue the industry training since in South Carolina we rely on company employees to do most of the foam work on their own farms. Another big one, for biosecurity considerations. There were concerns that initially the clean, dirty lines and personnel biosecurity was lacking. This needs to be priority and established early with each new infected premise. This is also something we need to train both state and industry personnel and have continuous training to review the processes. Another immediate item was to determine the location of car washes near each infected premises ahead of time so that these early personnel do not have to hunt for them on the farms when they're out in very rural areas and Google on their phone is not working. For the site manager with biosecurity oversight, we found that this really needs to be a unique position so that that person can focus only on the biosecurity activities and not be doing other positions as well. We need to have C&D and biosecurity procedures ahead of time for contractors to move big equipment and personnel off of low-pass and high-pass farms when they are finished. We had to create these documents on the spot in one day as the contractors had finished the farm and they wanted to leave and do normal work. I do thank North Carolina for allowing me to use their template for the low-pass procedures, but what I found frustrating was that I could not find any template for high-pass with USDA or any other states, and quite frankly, I was stuck. But it was good to have friends in many places, and I do thank US and Poultry Egg for helping me find information to create a procedure for high-pass that we were comfortable to use, and I especially thank them for translating both the low-pass and high-pass documents into Spanish by 5 o'clock that night to give to the contractor. Other lessons from this is needing either a cement pad or bringing in gravel to make a platform for the giant big equipment and vehicles to be cleaned and disinfected on. And the process of C&D and inspecting equipment is time-consuming, and you really need to know where to look and what to take apart on these machines to make sure that these items are being cleaned thoroughly. For disposal, we composted the feed, manure, and litter, and we had no bird carcasses. Normally, this process is managed as both minimum time and temperature for 2 heat treatment cycles, reaching the minimum temperature for a minimum days within a 14-day period for each cycle. And I believe 14 days is the magic time because that's usually how long bird carcasses take to reach those temperatures. But what about compost that does not have bird carcasses in it? The temperature are reached sooner. This should change from time and temperature to time at temperature for each cycle. The temperature should be driving the timing of the heat cycle. In the first Lowpass farm, we were able to complete the first cycle and move the compost out of the house after 10 days. We would like to see more research in this area of composting requirements without the bird carcasses. For burial, if allowed in the future, we would want to bury everything possible. Having pre-approved mass burial sites work best in the middle of an instant, which we had on the first farm, but we did not have on the second farm. We thought we had one, but it turned out the process was never finished with the grower. So our state environmental folks had to work very quickly from their homes during COVID, after hours, to assess the property and did find a place for burial. For public health and responder safety, we need to notify the public health veterinarian with the first case of Lowpass and not just high pass. And responders should wear their N95 respirators for both low and high pass. A good tip for my state counterparts, in your flock plans, be sure to include due dates for the different activities that need to be completed, such as C&D. That way, growers do not lose focus on the houses and start planting corn. This will reduce delays in releasing the zone since everyone is waiting for that last disinfection date.
One of the things that was something that we were adjusting with as it was happening was trying to figure out movement of birds when the event was still a low-pass avian influenza event. You cannot use eMERS, the gateway for a low-pass event, because the permitting potentially could have some connotations that may affect trade. So we worked on actually having physical conveyance documents that we could send electronically and have signatures associated with it. And it was a pretty good collaboration between North and South Carolina, reviewing these, evaluating them, using them, going back and fixing them again. And once we had a final document, it worked extremely well, even for the states that we were moving to outside of the Carolinas. We did have one state that had some testing requirements that were different, that were something that we had to adjust to a little bit, but it still worked well within our conveyance documents. Once we switched to high path mode, that's where eMERS gateway permitting came into play. And this, again, just emphasizes the need for continuous training for eMERS, for industry staff, for state officials. And one of the things that we did notice as a concern was that industry should be providing the receiving farm physical addresses for these permits for like chicks moving onto a farm. A lot of times we had some integrators there where the chicks would go to a hatchery where they needed some vaccination prior to going to a farm. So sometimes this was taking multiple steps in order to get that information. And so as fast as we can get that physical address from the industry, the more effectively this portion would go. COVID was a big issue that came into play during this event. Right as we were hitting avian influenza flocks left and right, we were also peaking in positivity rates and positive cases of COVID-19, especially in some of these counties where the flocks were being identified. We had issues with supplies and resources, whether it be biosecurity supplies like PPE, disinfectants, or laboratory supplies like just basic molecular slides, plates, that type of thing. And what it meant on the laboratory side is that we really had to adjust because we wanted to get results as quickly as possible, but we also had to maximize the efficiency of our testing, trying to fill up plates the best we could. So it was constantly a battle in order to keep the rapidity of testing and also improve on the efficiency of our resources. And then hotel and restaurant availability just for our field staff was something that was a logistical concern and did take a lot of resources to kind of figure out. On the people side, we had a lot of feedback on the North Carolina side with the number of farms that we had from field operation personnel and what it was like to work in a COVID-19 environment. One of their biggest concerns was just meeting their basic needs, the same type of thing as far as travel, hotels and restaurants, can they just keep food in their stomachs while they're out there? But then also travel into the area. Some people that were responders from out of state might have flown but now had to drive in because of COVID concerns. The whole incident command structure was definitely different because now we had to try to figure out virtual meetings between regional and centralized incident command people at the state level, but also USDA, contractors, industry. And so just communications of simple information about safety and operations became something that we had to relearn. And a lot of people missed that face-to-face interaction, but we did get some people that would comment that it actually helped them in practice on doing virtual meetings after the event was over when other people were just trying to figure these things out. But because there were so many virtual meetings, it did lead to a facilitation of the, or not facilitation, but a complication in how to make sure that everybody understood what their responsibilities were. So it was definitely something that led to complications in that matter. Also, we had just from the ground level people that were just worried about contracting this bug. And so the interactions between people and our staff and the contractors and the industry were definitely something that was having to be relearned, especially since the case rates were rising so high in Union and Anson County where these positive farms were located. And then wearing COVID PPE in just normal conversation was something that our staff needed to just kind of adjust to and get used to. We would have been more engaged with backyard independent flocks in these surveillance areas, but really that changed the outreach of us for our backyard independent flocks because of COVID concerns. In the field work, though, did for some individuals provide some normalcy, some point where people would be just sitting worried at home, wondering what was happening, going to work, working in the field, getting a job done, provided them some feeling of security, like they could just focus on work and they didn't have to worry about the nebulous disease. However, on the flip side, when it came to what about your home life, well, people definitely felt more isolated, more lonely. Sometimes they had quarantine, self-quarantine times before they came home, their family, because somebody in their family might be immunocompromised. And so there was a definitive feeling of loneliness and isolation that occurred with our staff.
So as you can see, this event was a big team effort, and we really believe we were successful in stopping this because of that. North Carolina, South Carolina, USDA, we thank you and our other past HPAI colleagues who were supportive during this animal disease event. And a shout out to that picture. Dr. Dale Lauer, Minnesota, was on my bulletin board with a grocery list of items that if I got stuck, I asked Dale. I also like to thank the North and South Carolina poultry industries, especially those companies involved in or around our zones for doing everything we had asked for and more. And all the receiving states of both our low-path movement requests and our high-path secure poultry supply permits to help keep our industries in business. And with that, we thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, to submit written questions, please be sure to select all panelists from the drop-down menu in Webex Chat before you type in your question and then press enter on your keyboard. Thank you. Go ahead, Liz.
Okay. Yeah, we have a couple questions. The first question is about how many total samples are collected per house?
So for Lowpass, in our Lowpass plan, we did is 10 birds per tube, 1 tube per house with a minimum of 3 tubes per farm. And then in High Path, that reverted to 11 birds per tube, I believe 2 tubes per house. And I'll just tell you a little thing. When I said about my information sheets to the industry, because it was very confusing between low and high path, my magic number for South Carolina is now 11 birds in the tube.
Yeah, in North Carolina, we did 1 tube per house, at least of 11 birds per tube. And I saw that there was a quick question that said what was SAHA, That's Southern Animal Health Association, and so that's a consortium of state animal health officials from the states from Texas to North Carolina to Florida.
Okay. And this person that was asking about how many samples were collected per house was based on, they were referring to environmental samples. I don't know if that changes your answer.
Yeah, so we picked 10 sites. So essentially we had 10 tubes, and we would sometimes scrub multiple sites for that one tube.
Okay.
Yeah, so there are standardized USDA documents that were actually very easy to follow and really good guidance on your environmental sampling. And so the protocols were the same for both states.
The next question is, other than FaceTiming to the inspector at the barn, what other social distancing methods were used in considerations to COVID?
Well, I'll tell you, in South Carolina, we never went home. We have been full-time in the office. So it's very interesting. We have some pictures. So our incident command post was in our large conference room. So we had to split out desks so that there were 6 feet apart for the different people working there. It was a little bit of a dance. We could only have 10 people in the room, and the rest of the command was down the hallway when we did our morning briefings. And anytime we had a lot of people on the phone, so anytime someone came up to speak, it was kind of like this little dance of rotating up to the front of the room. So in South Carolina, we just kind of did what we're doing now, is started wearing masks, started doing the social distancing, but we never left our building.
I think one of the things that was kind of interesting for me on the North Carolina side for COVID was that there was some concerns or reluctance about going virtual for certain meetings. There were certain things that people had always done in an incident command system, face-to-face interactions, and being able to immediately grab an individual and say, here, let's do this now. And there's definitely a lot of merit into that. But what I would say is that once you started going down the path of more virtual communications, and the more people became familiar and more comfortable with the ability to use virtual communications, whether it be Zoom-like meetings or just, texting or conference calls or those types of things, that it seemed to improve steadily over time to the point where you could get most things done, maybe not completely as efficiently as you would with a face-to-face, but a lot better than what most people probably would have given it credit for.
Okay. Is there any additional advice you can give regarding responding during COVID?
Avoid doing it if you can.
Yeah, it was just like this. It's just like all we needed was hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods. It's just keep adding emergencies. We deal with it. Have a lot. So what helped with us is having a lot of chocolate and snack and foods around the incident command.
Yeah, and I would just to tail in on what Julie was mentioning. What a lot of people don't realize is we literally did have tornadoes that came through right around the same time, causing damage to farms and requiring some flocks to be depopulated. We had a massive outbreak of infectious laryngotracheitis in North Carolina that was ongoing, and we had some flash flooding things with some of the rains that were concerns, and always the threat of tropical storms and hurricanes. And I think that, trying to make sure you're communicating with your staff to the best of their ability, trying to minimize that feeling of isolation and loneliness that they might be feeling is it's going to be a constant challenge, but something that I said is well worth it. Just trying to keep that family mentality, and we're going to get through this together.
Another question is, will you share the updated plans?
Yes, we were always happy to share updated plans because that's how we learn from each other.
Right. So how would you like to do that?
I'll say on the North Carolina side, we're going through the process of our updates, and we're very close to getting to the point where we feel like we have a finished product. My inclination would be, just so that we're not having to send multiple drafts, is that anybody who would be wanting a copy of the North Carolina plan, just let me know. But what I would be trying to do is I'd like to be able to get through the final bits of our revisions, make sure that USDA has a chance to look at it and approve it, and then once it is approved, I have no problem whatsoever with sharing it to everybody as far as where we're at.
Okay. So anybody that's been on this webinar today that signed in with their first and last name and their email, I can get that attendance report to both you and Julie so you have their contact information.
Okay. And I'm sure if they Google us in our states, they will find our email.
They will find you. Yes, they will. How many staff total were deployed for this response?
I don't have that sit rep in front of me, so I can't say off the top of my head.
Because, you know, we had, and that's difficult because you're going to have all the state personnel that were responding, all the USDA personnel that were responding. You're going to have all the contractors that were responding. And then, you know, you can't fail to include all the industry people that were part of the response. And, you know, that's important because, you know, you have some of the industry that did step up and try to help out with things like depopulation and such. Because hopefully it facilitated things on a regional level for everybody to get those birds depopulated quickly. So there was a lot of response that was going, a lot of bodies, and I think it would be easy to undercount that number.
Okay. Did you have a joint command ICS, or was this the lacking part that created the communication and action confusion?
So what we had was a state-led, USDA-supported event on the South Carolina side.
Yeah, and we had a state-led response on the North Carolina side, and I'll tell you that I did not think that the fact that South Carolina had their own incident command and North Carolina had their own incident command led to any of the confusion that I'm aware of. I actually think that the interactions between the states worked really, really well, just us constantly keeping each other apprised and sharing information and documentation. I think more what was the issue was when we had communications associated with the virtual element and also stuff coming from the field and who does it go to, and that led to discrepancies about whose responsibility was what and misinformation. So the fact that we had two separate incident commands, I don't think really was a problem in any way that I saw, which was really a good thing as far as our ability to just communicate in the Carolinas.
The next question is, how many contractors were involved and how were they managed by each state or both and or USDA?
We had, I don't know what the sheer numbers of, but we did have one contracting crew that was managed by the industry, and then USDA took over the oversight and management, and that is one of those things where from the state level, you know, we're looking at that as far as in future events how that would better play out, and whether or not that would be something that we would want to manage at the state level side, even though we weren't involved with it during the event.
So, yeah, with South Carolina, we were not directly managing the contractors.
It was also mentioned that the surveillance testing data was old in EMRS and didn't mesh with what was known. Were the roads driven to identify all poultry in the zones?
Correct. I mean, if that's what you mean, you know, as soon as you lay down a zone and you start contacting the companies to tell them, because there are responders to go out and collect samples, then all of a sudden you find out, you know, half the farms are retired, or they have a whole bunch of new farms, so you're sitting down really quickly to just update, and you're asking all the companies, send me your updated lists. So usually it's dropping down the zone is what triggers that.
Yeah, and I think that when we were looking at active farms and such, you know, at the state level, there's a constant challenge to try to make sure you have the updated information for these farms as best as you can. And we do, I think, a pretty good job as far as trying to make sure that that information gets updated in EMERS. But we ended up with a massive update right during the time of the event, and we ended up trying to respond as quickly as we could to anything as far as inactive farms being inactive and so on and so forth. And some of the things that were happening on the EMERS side that we're seeing for North Carolina is, for instance, having 2 farms in the EMERS database that had the same national ID number, but were actually the same farm and had already gotten cleared, and, you know, like the one farm was already gone from our database, but it existed twice in the EMERS database. And so then they would say, well, we have this information for this farm and we didn't see testing from that. Where is this farm? And so there was a lot of things that were like that were just general data management types of items that I think always could be looked at and seeing, like, how does the data transfer can occur more effectively. But the state response wasn't really slowed significantly from the data that we had. If anything, it seemed like the data that we had at the state level seemed to be more up to date, and so we knew what was active and what wasn't.
Can you expand on the messaging to public concern?
So the messaging is a specific way electronically, and I am not this type of person to really know what I'm talking about, but essentially that messaging from diagnostic labs could be directly electronically messaged into another database. And so you would get those results in your own database without having to go through send me Excel sheets and then uploading that information into your data. It is something that the National Animal Health Laboratory Network non-labs do now. Then they message the results that we received in our non-lab was messaged directly to USDA. And that happens right now. But what we really need is we really need the NPIP labs to be able to message to the state veterinarian's office for the flocks that they are testing for them, especially if these labs are out of state, so that the state veterinarian's office knows exactly what testing is being done in their state.
Okay. Which virtual meeting platform did you use for communications?
So for North Carolina, we used mostly Microsoft Teams at that point, although when you're dealing with other agencies, Zoom meetings were definitely ongoing because not everybody was as familiar with Microsoft Teams. But those would be the 2 primary platforms that we were using.
Yeah, in South Carolina, we were mainly in person, so it was either face-to-face or phone calls or emails.
Okay. Would you consider a completely virtual ICF? Why or why not?
I'll go first. No. I'm a people person. Definitely, I think, as incident commander for South Carolina, having everybody in the building with me helped me tremendously. It would not have been effective trying to do this virtually.
Yeah, and I would say I agree conceptually that when you have a face-to-face incident command, it definitely runs more effectively, but having done portions of our incident command virtually, it is a doable thing. So I guess my perspective would be, you know, hope for the best, but plan for the worst. I think planning for a completely virtual incident command structure is something that should definitely be done, definitely considered, and people should have the way in mind on how to move forward with that. Just because you know, would we have ever thought we would be having this conversation in 2019? And, you know, for me, it's no. I wouldn't have considered that this would have been part of our conversation. As such, we now have had this event. We're learning how to use virtual technology. And I think that since we've already been proven we don't know exactly what's around the corner, you know, if we can do face-to-face incident command, I think that is the better way, more efficient to go. But I just feel like we have to be prepared for a virtual incident command given the uncertainties of the world.
The next question is, were responders tested for COVID-19? And if so, how often?
We did not in South Carolina.
We had one individual that I was aware of that was tested because of some some signs that we did not think was COVID, but we couldn't guarantee that it wasn't COVID. And so we requested that that individual get tested, and they tested negative.
Okay. What was the reason for not testing backyard flocks within the HPAI control area in South Carolina and just to do outreach?
The biggest reason, because it was such a sparsely populated area, and we didn't feel that it was going to be a waste of time and effort. And plus, we were on, COVID lockdown. Our people, even during that time, we couldn't do our normal small flock NPIP because of the COVID risk with strangers. So we only, we're doing the commercial work. So that was the biggest thing. It was sparsely populated, and plus, when it started off with Lowpass, there were no symptoms in most of the flocks, and so there weren't, backyard poultry dying. We have an established system now that works all the time, so on the website they can put in a report, or they call me directly, they email me, they text me, they know me. So if there's any dead or sick birds, I get this all year long. So what we did is we found the backyard premises through what we had in our database, as well as what we had delivered from NPIP hatcheries, and we sent them proactively letters telling them the situation, how to use biosecurity, what AI was about, and to call us if they ever did have sick and dead birds.
Yeah, and I would definitely want to just emphasize that this virus, other than the one high-path farm, there were no farms with clinical signs, and there were no farms with increased mortality. And if you look at a lot of the USDA recommendations now that have changed for sampling of backyard independent flocks, a lot of them talk about sampling a select group of flocks that have some clinical presentation. And so we also had very few backyard independent flocks in these areas, and didn't really have any feeling like, if it stayed low path, that there would be many signs and symptoms. So we similarly just tried to do information outreach, especially with the fear of COVID, especially with people not only afraid of other people, but just randomly afraid of anything that was a respiratory disease. Seemed like a bad idea to start going door to door and asking if their chickens are coughing.
So the next question is, how important was to have Spanish and English information available in a timely manner? Was your Hispanic population big enough to make it absolute necessary or not?
It was the contract workers that had a lot of Latino employees, so that was critical. It is something here at Clemson that I've always had an issue with, because I don't have anybody within the university that can automatically translate any of our documentation, none that I have ever found. So it was critical because I had to have it then because of having the Latino workers. And they may get an English thing and nod that they understand, but maybe not really understand what's going on. And since it was about biosecurity coming on and off these farms and C&D of their equipment, it was critical that they really understood everything.
Yeah. And, and similarly in North Carolina, we don't have resources for translations much. And so I would just say my hat's off to USDA and a lot of their materials and resources that are really good and easy to send around and stuff are both in English and Spanish. And so I greatly commend USDA for doing that with a lot of their informational resources.
What in the sequence informed you the virus was likely to flip?
Mike, I'll let you take that one. It's the cleavage site, but that's about all I know.
Yeah, so NVSL did a sequencing of the initial isolates. And within the initial isolates, this is the best to my ability to be able to translate it, they found a single cleavage site that was consistent with a mutation that would occur and that could make it go to a high-path AI event. So we had the experts like Mia Trichetti kind of giving us information and feedback, and all of it was basically like, this is a virus that we need to be concerned about. This is a virus that could mutate to high path based upon the history that we have with sequencing of similar viruses. And then again, that led to a rapid response from USDA and state agencies, which, like Dr. Helm was talking about, was very, very helpful for us nipping this event in the bud.
What are some of the electronic tools used to share documents in the virtual ICP, database platforms, collaboration on documents, et cetera?
At North Carolina side, there were some concerns about the security associated with Dropbox, and that was one of the reasons why we went to Microsoft Teams. Our IT people felt that the sharing of files and documents and communications through Microsoft Teams was a much safer platform, and that's where we did most of our file transfer.
Okay. You also mentioned the need for further training. Can this training be accomplished remotely, or does some training require face-to-face?
I think that a lot of the training could be done remotely just so that way you can have the ability to train more people. As soon as you require face-to-face, it intrinsically limits your ability to get some people together. So from the standpoint of having more bodies trained, I think it would be great to have it remote.
Correct. And there's just some training that you need to do in person to, make sure everybody understands. So like, actually doing biosecurity, the clean, dirty line, proper sampling. You can do a webinar, you can show pictures, but until people feel it, handle it, do it, take off, take on, they sometimes don't really understand. So that's a limiting factor now is why we were actually scheduled to have a spring industry foam training event, which was canceled because we were doing it for real. And we said, we'll just do it in the fall. But because of COVID, we're not allowed to bring people together for meetings. So COVID is kind of restricting, training that we need to do in person. But that doesn't stop us for doing virtual training if we can't get together. But definitely there's some in-person components to that are important.
Yeah, and I would agree with Dr. Helm. I am a big fan of in-person training because of the effectiveness of it. I don't feel that you can have virtual training for a lot of skills that are as effective as in-person. It's just we're in a different world now, that's all.
I'm glad to hear that, being a training specialist for USDA. I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then we're going to have to close out as we're getting close to our time. One of the things is, yes, this webinar is being recorded. It will be posted in the next week on the National Training and Exercise Program video gallery for everybody to look at that. So our next question is, were you able to get PPE for the industry from USDA since they were part of the response?
So the answer is no. I had hoped years ago, I had thought, because they are considered our responders, they're doing, a big grunt of the work, that I would be able to use the USDA cooperative agreement money not only to supply us with PPE, but to supply the industry. And the answer was no.
And similar in North Carolina, there was, I'm not sure if it was just inability to do it or other various things as far as legal concerns and considerations and such, but we might consider these individuals as responders, but they weren't part of the state response. And so as such, it was deemed that they needed to provide their own PPE, just like a subcontractor might.
The next question.
And my feeling about that is, they're not state employees, but they're definitely part of the state response, because otherwise we would be the ones, or our USDA folks would be the ones out there at all the commercial farms, and we just can't do it in South Carolina. So to me, they are part of the state response, even though they're not a state employee.
Okay. Given that this was a relatively localized outbreak with an incredibly swift response, what was the ballpark cost for this response?
I don't think we have that yet.
I had heard some rough estimate that was somewhere under, I'm just going to mess it up. It was not like a huge number at the state side. My understanding is that most of the cost was borne upon USDA, so USDA staff would have a better idea of that. The state costs was a fraction of what the federal cost was.
Okay. How were federal personnel integrated into the corresponding state-led ICF?
Could you repeat the first part?
how are federal personnel integrated into the corresponding state-led ICS?
So in South Carolina, we were state-led, USDA supported, and we did have a couple of USDA employees. One of them was our primary site manager at the Hpai farm, and then we were just in phone contact with our assistant ABIC in South Carolina.
In North Carolina, the operations chief for our incident command was a USDA individual, and then we had one or two other USDA officials that were cycling in as consultants within the command system as far as agency representatives. And then we had multiple people in the field that were operating as like site case manager type of roles. We also had USDA that was heavily involved in the epidemiological survey that was being built as an online survey.
Okay, I'm going to take the last couple questions, and then we're going to have to call it a day. Did you use Survet 1, 2, 3 in surveillance side or epidemiology?
I'm unfamiliar with Survet as far as whether it was used or not. That would be a question I think we would have for our USDA partners in SIA.
Okay. Was there any indemnity or compensation paid to positive LPAI and HPAI producers?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. That's a good question.
Yeah.
That's a quick question.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the biggest thing on that, I would say, is that all the documentation that USDA requires needs to be in place before you start depopulating. And we waited for USDA approval as far as somebody saying, yes, you are approved to start depopulating. So if you're looking for full indemnity and compensation, you want to make sure that that discussion is complete before you depopulate a flock.
Okay. And the last question I'm going to take is, do you have any of the FEMA available ICS courses incorporated into your training program for your response staff?
Emergency programs handles a lot of our ICS type of training. I don't recall anything that was a specific FEMA module, but we all go through the standard, I don't know if they're part of FEMA or not, but the standard 100, 200, 700, 800 series and other 300, 400 for people that are higher up in the command structure.
Okay. So that's true for us, too, doing those basic ICS trainings.
Okay, well, that was a very informative webinar, and thank you to Dr. Helm and Dr. Martin for providing all that information. And thank you for everybody for joining us. We do have a few other webinars scheduled for the month of October and, of course, into November. So please be sure to watch your email for those announcements. And with that, I will bid you all to have a great rest of your day.
That concludes
Thank you, everyone.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Services. You may now disconnect.